Welcome to the Innovator Series. Identity and access management is looked at as a subset of cybersecurity, but in reality, it's its own industry. For the past 15 to 20 years, although we've seen a lot of improvements in authentication and single sign on, for the most part, the way we deploy and operate these technologies has stayed relatively stagnant. There's authentication, authorization, and auditing. It's the authorization that needs to work. Today, as it was in 2001, management of roles, groups, or attributes is the way we handle authorization. Deployments take a long time simply because it takes a long time to gather this information in organizations. Management of those environments is labor intensive. Takes a lot of process to maintain all of that. And still, there are huge gaps in the way access is given to employees versus how much access they really need. Today, we're talking to Scott Kriz, co-founder of Signal. Signal, founded during the pandemic in 2021, is really reshaping the way authorization happens in the enterprise. And Scott's the right person for the job. Scott started Signal after years at Google solving the same problem. Scott, welcome to the Innovator Series. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, great to be here, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'd love to start with your background in identity and access. Maybe start from the beginning, your first IAM company.
Yeah, sure. So, interestingly enough, my first kind of experience within identity was as a customer, as most is. And back in 2012, actually 2011, I was evaluating Okta as a customer. And Okta was pretty new. They were a few years old, and it was doing a pretty good job at handling single sign-on if you were very Microsoft-based. The company that I was at the time was not using Office as its primary identity, and it was using actually Google, which was called Google Apps for Business at the time. So after evaluating it, and we were in the process of kind of rolling up that company and selling it, we realized that we didn't think that Okta was doing a great job. So we started a competitor to Okta,
Wow.
and fast forward 6 years, the company was called Vidium. We were straight up competing with Okta and winning some enterprise contracts. And an interesting thing happened in 2017. Okta filed to go public, which waved a big flag to the industry saying this is not just a feature, this is a real business. And some of the biggest partners of ours took notice, and we ended up selling the company to Google Cloud in 2017. That became Google's identity offering, now called Google Cloud Identity, which was focused
Yeah.
on single sign-on, provisioning, and directory sync.
Incredible. And talk to us about your time at Google, because suddenly you're in this much larger organization and you're seeing these problems in the space.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Obviously, going from a startup to a company with over 300,000 employees
Yeah.
was quite a change. And so, after a few years of rebuilding a lot of the features and functionality, adding to the team, and deploying on Google Tech, that offering within the workspace group, I got really interested in some of the things that were occurring internally around authorization. And specifically, as you probably know, Google and all the alphabet companies are really good at protecting data, and that has a number of different layers to it from authorization. Most importantly, how internal folks, contractors, vendors, and employees were getting to customer data. And we recognized that while we were doing a great job, it was still very much in the camp that a lot of enterprises are today, with role-based access control, attribute-based access, things called RBAC, ABAC,
Yeah.
and security groups. And these were really good, but they were very administrative time, and we wanted to evolve that into something that was more just in time and evaluating if there was a justification for every time something was accessed. And so that's where I spent the next 2 years, is really trying to solve that problem within all the alphabet companies.
So like 300,000 employees, 300,000 groups, something like that.
It's interesting. I think most people know, if they've worked with enterprise, that you quickly get more roles than users,
Yeah.
which is a little confusing to think about, but it makes sense once you see it in action. It does stand out as an opportunity to improve how you're doing it.
Yeah. So you kind of fixed that model at Google where you no longer dependent on that role to employee ratio to solve the problem. Maybe talk specifically about like that turn to leaving Google and starting Signal, and what sort of the opportunity is.
Yeah, sure. So as we went to solve this problem internally, at first it was me and one engineering lead, and it quickly turned into over 40 people working on this problem. And we were successfully doing this and rolling it out. But what I did realize in that time was that there were 40 people that were engineers and product managers full time at Google, and the team was growing every single year that were working on this problem. And it seemed to me not ideal that you would have folks focused on these internal things that maybe those same people might be better used or utilized to be revenue generating participants in the company. And so I went around to a number of CISOs in the industry. One was top of mind at the time. It was Joe Sullivan from Cloudflare, and he's now an advisor to our company, and sharing the experiences at companies like Uber and Facebook and at Cloudflare. And it seemed like this problem was something that all enterprises encountered. And so that was really where it occurred to me that all of these companies were going to build their own teams to try to solve the problem, because they felt that it was so nuanced that it was going to be hard to find a vendor. And that was enough for me and my co-founder from my last company to have our same last day at Google, and then go off and start Signal to try to solve that problem at scale for other companies.
So you and I touched on it, right? So your large enterprise today has more roles than employees, and that's how they sort of manage authorization. What kind of paint a picture of what is this future state, and what as enterprises embrace this new model you guys are working on, what does it look like in reality?
So one thing I'd like to think about when I think about the problem and solution space is, what is this actually achieving? And one of the things that we realized was that the authentication problem is largely solved. And so we kind of know who a user is, although in some cases through credential theft or session hijacking, that might not be the actual user you think it is. And so we looked at that and we analyzed all the problems that occurred with that being the case. And there's a huge blast radius of what happens to being that user. And we looked at that as an authorization problem. And so what our company now sets out to do is reduce the blast radius of these events like session hijacking or credential theft. And where we try to drive is, there's this concept of least standing privilege. And we like to even push it further into the aspirational zero standing privilege over time.
Right.
And that means that if you think about being an employee at a large company, you should, as a default, probably not have access to anything unless it is assessed on the fly and there's a business justification behind that, as long as it's not causing latency and business disruption.
So example that comes to mind is, if I'm on the help desk, why would I access somebody's computer unless there's a ticket to access their computer? So there's a piece of data there that determines whether I should get access.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that exact use case doesn't only apply for support, but in a lot of cases it exists for production environments. So let's say you're a DevOps engineer and you need to get to a production instance of Amazon AWS. Today, you might use something like a CyberArk to check out credentials and log in, but perhaps you want to get a little bit more specific because that's a dangerous thing to get access to. And maybe you do want to rely on a ticket that's open in ServiceNow or some other homegrown ticketing system. So that's the type of workflow that we solve for, is to make sure that there's very fine-grained authorization occurring, and it's taking into account a lot of business context that comes from things like ticketing systems or comes from things like Okta or Workday.
So that's the name Signal, right? Where you guys pull in lots of different signals across the business to make these decisions?
Yeah, that's right. And there's two reasons we called it Signal. One is that we want to make sure that these checks are happening in line, but also we wanted to promote a capability where if something happens in a third-party system, that could be a MDM provider, it could be a SaaS application, it could be the IDP, that they can actually transmit a signal to us. Yep. And that signal then can be broadcast out to other applications. When you think about a use case like if you are Okta and you have something bad happening with a user, or even you offboard somebody, you're shutting them off in that identity provider, but they still might have sessions inside of things like Salesforce or a mobile app. And so this enables and facilitates the ability to remove that authorization in real time.
That's awesome. So you guys not only are building the products, but you guys are also contributing to the sort of next generation protocols that are going to make this sort of the standard way of doing authorization. Is that right?
Yeah, something we realized early on, and especially with this experience as in the authentication space with things like SAML that took decades to evolve.
Yeah,
we realized Yeah, they take a long time, but we realize that if it's not really focused on a standard, it has limited utility to the customers and to other vendors. So our CTO was actually at Google and I think it was around 2018, 2019, he published what's called a CAPE standard, Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol. It's now part of the OpenID Foundation's Shared Signals and Events
Okay.
group, and he's a co-chair of that as well. And we decided that this was the perfect type of standard to leverage, and so that's what we've done is we've leveraged CAPE so that we can be both a receiver of messages and a transmitter of those messages out to all of the applications and services.
So as this protocol gets embedded in anybody that's using sort of OpenID type authentication, now your product can just plug right in because everyone's speaking the same language. Is that right?
It's really that last mile. So after you have that authentication sorted out, this is really on the authorization side of saying it's not just a handshake of you're authenticated, but after that, how
Yeah.
do you actually then talk to each other and tell each other this should not, that no more behavior should be occurring here?
Continuously. Right. Because I think in SAML, it's like, am I good? We're good. Okay. You're off and running. And then like, this would be impossible to do unless there was something continuously sort of asking those questions.
That's exactly right. And some of the we have an investment from companies like Microsoft's an investor, Cisco's an investor, and so this is something that they very much believe in from the IDP perspective.
Yeah.
That this fulfills a need that hasn't existed up until this time.
Yeah, that's a great natural segue. So IDPs, because of these standards, they get built into the IDPs. They're ready to go with Signal. Suddenly, you guys can work with Okta, Ping/ForgeRock, SailPoint, and you guys can leverage your connectors to collect all these signals to make decisions, and they'll work with all those IDPs.
Yeah, and we do see a lot of, I'd say mostly in the market right now, we're seeing Microsoft and Ping and Okta. And interestingly enough, the larger the enterprise, they're usually using 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 identity providers within the company.
That's incredible. And I mean, it seems crazy that, like I said early on, it seems crazy that it's taken us so long to get to this point to reinvent this. Is there something that has changed in the world of technology that's enabling this, or is just really that you guys had this vision and were able to make this happen versus no one else has been able to thus far?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, you can look backwards and say, well, why was there not an Okta before Okta existed?
Yeah.
And I think with anything in security, it's a constant evolution of what is the next thing that's solving problems that we're just now realizing. And some of the top of mind things that are occurring in the wild right now are when people are assuming the identity and getting past even the multi-factor.
Yeah.
So once you have the session, you don't have to go through a single sign-on or multi-factor. You can kind of parade your way around an organization. We're seeing that be exposed a lot more than we had in the past. And I think with the increase in sophistication around attacks with credential theft, with session hijacking, and leveraging these very persistent AIs that are being created, it makes it a lot more top of mind, not just because it's more possible for that compromise, but because that blast radius, if it's not going towards zero standing privilege, becomes a lot more impactful with that type of persistent attack.
Yeah, and because these attacks are happening and we're seeing them.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk me through this idea of, if I'm listening to this and I'm an organization and I understand this paradigm's coming, it's getting, the protocol's getting built into the IDPs, Signal's here to provide the software. This is a sea change that's coming. Traditionally in your identity and access projects, you all get together in a room and you whiteboard out the 3,000 roles you need and how you're going to manage them. That sounds like with this paradigm, it's going to be different. Maybe it's going to be more use case driven. Can you maybe talk about what companies would do to prepare for this paradigm shift in authorization?
Yeah. So I think it is a paradigm shift. Although I wouldn't say that, work going into some type of RBAC deployment like a SailPoint was not valuable and won't continue to be valuable. In fact, we have a technical partnership with them where we leverage roles inside of policy to do more granular things. So I think first of all, it's figuring out where in the maturity curve is your organization. All right, have you consolidated an IDP? Have you gone through MFA? And I know for a lot of folks that would sound obvious. Of course, they've done that, but in large legacy organizations, sometimes they're mid-flight in the MFA path.
Sure.
Have you gone through looking at your PAM solution and IGA solution. Where are you in that process? So it's making sure that it's the right timing for the organization. We generally think of, everyone's moving in the same direction, but the urgency depends on the actual use case. So
Right.
I would say that we become really valuable in the post centralized IDP and MFA world. We do meet folks that haven't kind of taken that on; they're more on-prem, and so those tend to be less top of mind from an urgency perspective. So from a preparation perspective, I think it's making sure that you understand the core business and the highest risks associated with it, whether that be a CMMC regulatory thing, whether it be operational based, and figure out what is the problem you're trying to solve. And so I think that's more important than, there's always more security that you can add in organizations,
Right.
whether it's at the network layer, whether it's at the identity layer or the application layer, but to look at what is serving for the business and is that one of the top 3 priorities for you.
Got it. So almost a prioritization of lines of business by criticality and saying, okay, which ones do we want to sort of, as you said, shrink that blast radius in what order?
Yeah, and certainly taking a look at how risky is bad code finding its way into production. So how much do you need to protect GitHub or whatever you're using as a repository? How important and how protected and how comfortable are you with your AWS environment and who gets production access when? Or are they just like a handful of people based on maybe a role or maybe based on their individual names that have that production access? Is that persistent? Are they able to log in when they're traveling in Europe? Or if they're based in Europe when they're traveling to the US.
Right.
And so these are the questions I think that, you have to ask, or how important is that production environment to protect in a way that isn't being solved currently by the existing solutions.
Yeah. Awesome. Scott, thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this. And looking forward to learning more about Signal and doing more with you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Eron. It's been great to catch up and chat.